got a special guest for you today. I know you're used to seeing Colonel Ryan Dillon up there for the OIR update briefs. But this week we are honored to have Major General James Jarrard, the Special Operations Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve Commander. So JTF-OIR is the primary advise, assist, and accompany force in Syria, working closely with the SDF as they work to defeat ISIS in that very complicated battle space. So JTF-OIR does have an advise and assist presence in Iraq as well, sharing those duties with the Combined Joint Task Force Land Component Command, CJTF. I'm sure you've heard that before. But again, they really are the driving force behind the enormous success of working by, with, and through our partner forces on the ground in Syria.
All right. Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm here today to talk about the SDF's success in Syria and how our coalition continues our support. As you know, our coalition was established to militarily defeat Daesh. Their extremist ideology and gross disregard for humanity pose a serious threat to Iraq, Syria, and our homelands. We continue to work by, with, and through our partners to militarily defeat Daesh, and we will continue our efforts until the Daesh threat is permanently removed. Once we have successfully defeated Daesh, the coalition will continue to have a key role for enduring counter-VEO efforts. Raqqa was held by Syrian opposition forces until falling into Daesh's hands in January of 2014. Daesh called it the capital for their so-called caliphate, and the city soon became a focus for terrorists committed to barbaric acts against international humanitarian law and basic human rights. Beheadings, crucifixions, and torture became the norm for thousands of innocent civilians who were trapped inside the city by Daesh and used as human shields. Defensive positions were routinely established in hospitals, mosques, schools, and other protected sites to provide cover for Daesh's operations. Civilians attempting to flee were routinely shot and killed by these terrorists. On June 6, 2017, the SDF began their push to liberate Raqqa. This multi-religious and multi-ethnic alliance of Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Yazidis, Armenians, and Turkmen, which also includes female fighters and commanders, overpowered an entrenched enemy and demonstrated courage and tenacity in the face of significant losses. Precision coalition air support and ground artillery enabled the SDF's advance throughout and minimized civilian casualties in the process. Some of you heard last week from General Eisler about the protocols we use for conducting targeting in areas near civilians. I will emphasize that our coalition always seeks to apply the four basic principles of the law of armed conflict in this regard: proportionality, distinction, military necessity, and the avoidance of unnecessary human suffering. Raqqa was liberated on October 20th. The false governance structures of Daesh were removed for good, and the weakness of their military strength exposed. Many SDF soldiers were wounded and killed for their efforts, and we honor the sacrifices that led to their victory. The coalition support to Raqqa continues with a whole of government effort, including our partners at Department of State and USAID. We are all supporting the Raqqa Civil Council, or RCC, the local governing body, who is working to stabilize the city that Daesh destroyed. There will be several months of tough work to clear each building. This multi-ethnic body has engaged with local tribal leaders to prioritize tasks in the recovery efforts. The RCC has started to provide essential services and deliver aid. The RCC is coordinating with various aid agencies operating in the area to ensure internally displaced persons, or IDPs, have access to water, food, and shelter. It is a big job and will take some time. The Raqqa Internal Security Force, or RISF, is an indigenous partner force established to provide local security and prevent Daesh's reemergence. The RISF answers to the RCC and continues to grow in size and will, at some point in the near future, assume control of the city from the SDF. For the people of Raqqa at the moment, it is still unsafe for them to return home. Although the city is void of Daesh fighters, hundreds and maybe even thousands of Daesh improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, bombs, and booby traps remain. Sadly, civilian deaths have already been reported among some of those who have tried to return. The clearance process will take time as teams assess, identify, and remove explosive hazards. In the coming weeks, the SDF will serve as the hold force, continuing to clear explosive hazards from the city, preparing to turn over security in the city to the RISF at some point in the near future. Civilians will be allowed back in the city once conditions are safe. The RCC is leading the way in providing advice to Raqawis about when they may be able to return home. I know they need more help with the removal of these explosive hazards. Internationally supported stabilization efforts are central to the enduring security and stabilization of life after Daesh. The loss of Raqqa was a major blow to Daesh and exposed the lies, cowardice, and evil in the Daesh ideology. Yet these terrorists still exist. Together, the coalition will continue our support to the SDF as they liberate the remainder of areas along the Euphrates River to the border with Iraq. I'll close by outlining what the SDF successes over the last several months tell us. Daesh has no capital and no physical caliphate. Daesh is running out of places to hide. Daesh terrorists are running away from our partners and the coalition. Their leaders are in hiding. Raqqa was freed by Syrians. Raqqa will be secured by Syrians. Raqqa will be governed by Syrians.
Wondering if you're concerned after the fall of ISIS, especially in Syria, that you will also see the sectarian divides arise again in that area. Your area seems almost, it could possibly be even more complicated than in northern Iraq, and what you plan to do to prevent that from happening.
Well, thank you for that question. And I guess my personal experience tells me that may not be one of the areas of concern for us. As I have traveled around and have talked to the SDF leaders personally, there is a large percentage of the SDF that are Arabs, working very closely with the Kurdish personnel in the SDF. And they are working together very, very well. In fact, the commander of the SDF that was in charge of the Raqqa operation was an Arab. And the second data point I will give you is that there are hundreds and thousands of Arabs that are fleeing from around the Euphrates River Valley, from Dar es-Zawr to Mayadin to down around Al-Qaim. And they are fleeing, they're fleeing Daesh, they're fleeing the regime liberation of those cities, and they're not going south into Arab-controlled territories. They're going north into the SDF-controlled territories. And so that tells me that they understand the risk of both and that they would much rather be in the SDF-controlled territories. And so I think that those examples, plus the examples in Manbij and Topka, where everybody, the stabilization efforts are underway and everything is going well, are clear examples that this may not be one of those areas that we need to be concerned about.
If the Syrian regime army tries to take back this region, which is an oil-rich region, will the U.S. come to support the SDF militarily?
What I can say is that we are committed to support the SDF through the military defeat of Daesh. The liberation of Daesh from areas on the east and west, on the east and north side of the Euphrates River is the first step, but there's a long process after that, making sure that we have the security in place, the stabilization efforts in place to allow the IDPs to return home. That is all part of the military defeat of Daesh, making sure that we treat the symptoms that allowed Daesh to take over this area in the first place. And we are committed to supporting the SDF throughout that process.
What will happen after?
I think that is obviously a policy decision, and how long we will be there supporting the SDF is not for me to answer. But I will say that we are committed to making sure that the region is stable and secure, and the evil of Daesh is not welcome in that area, and the SDF are able to provide security, and the local civil structures are able to provide governance.
I would like to hear from you, sir, an assessment about your interactions with the Russians and the Syrian regime in that area, the northeast of and the east of Syria. How close are you operating to them?
Okay, Eric, I had a little bit of a hard time, but I think the question was, how hard are we working, or how close are we working with the Syrian regime? And my answer is we are not working with the Syrian regime at all. We are working and supporting the SDF. There are deconfliction efforts with the Russians that we, at various levels, from the operational level at the CJTF headquarters, all the way up to very senior levels of our government, to make sure that we understand where each other are on the battlefield, and we do not interact with each other. But there is no coordination or working relationship with the Syrian regime.
My question was about your interactions with the Russians and the Syrian regime. As a commander on the field, on the ground, how close your operations are from them?
So thank you, and I understand better now. So the enemy, we are both focused on Daesh. And as such, sometimes our actions do become close, but there is no tactical deconfliction on the ground between commanders, even on each side of the Euphrates River. As I said earlier, the operational level all the way to senior leaders in our government do have deconfliction measures that we will take. And there is a direct line for air deconfliction between their air forces and our air forces, and we do use that routinely. But there is no deconfliction channel for discussions on the ground.
Having the Syrian regime pushing towards the Bukamal area, backed by the Russians, and at the same time we have the Iraqi security forces with the PMF conducting operations surrounding the Al-Qaim and the Khabur areas. How likely you think Iran would be able to control the Iraqi-Syrian border, especially in that area, the Bukamal Al-Qaim area?
And so there are close coordination between the coalition forces and our partners, both the SDF on the northeast Syria side, and on in Iraq with the Iraqi security forces. So we are very well synchronized in our efforts as we both move, as the ISF in Iraq moves to the west, and as the SDF in Syria moves to the east. We continue to deconflict with the Russians as they assist the Syrian regime forces moving down the southern side of the Euphrates. I do not think that there will be any Iranian control of the border from inside of Iraq. I do think that there is that potential in Syria, but that is a question for the Syrian regime, and I do not have good information and am not able to answer that question in sufficient detail that I think would satisfy you.
You had mentioned before how well the Kurdish members of the SDF are working with the Arab members. In addition, it seems like coalition has worked well with Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what it is about the Kurdish that have been so effective and what has made them good partners in the fight against ISIS.
And I think that, first of all, they have an indomitable will. They were backed up in Kobani several years ago, and Daesh almost overran their position in Kobani. And I think a small group of them got together and agreed with each other. They were not going to let this happen to them or the people or the territory, the historical Kurdish area. And they decided that they were going to defeat Daesh. And ever since then, they have been ferocious fighters and excellent leaders and pretty amazing tacticians as they have methodically taken back their terrain from Daesh. And they continued even to today, and they are committed to, and they have worked with the tribal sheikhs as they move into more historically Arab terrain and less Kurdish historical terrain. They work very closely with the tribal sheikhs, and they are working with the Arabs and all of the ethnic makeup of the SDF very, very well. And they're all committed. The single unifying enemy of Daesh and the evil that they displayed throughout all of northeast Syria has unified all of these ethnic groups to work very, very closely together and very effectively to take back those areas that Daesh control.
How many U.S. troops are there in Iraq and Syria right now?
We have I think it's a little over 4,000 U.S. troops in Syria right now that are supporting efforts against Daesh and supporting the SDF.
So you have 4,000 U.S. troops in Syria, because I thought that previously the number was 1,000. So this would be 4 times, well, it was actually 500, but you're saying 4,000 U.S. troops are currently in Syria?
I'm sorry, I misspoke there. There are approximately 500 troops in Syria.
I think the accurate number is 1,000.
Idris, as you know, the FML is 503 in Syria and 5262 in Iraq.
You said that you don't have concern about kind of breaks within the SDF because the Arab component and the Kurdish component of the SDF are currently working very closely. But we saw the same thing in Iraq. The Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces were working very closely together, very coordinated. They took over Mosul. Peshmerga enabled the liberation of Mosul to a great extent. And now we see that these two forces are fighting each other. So what else do you have other than just your confidence or your just trust in the cooperation currently going on the ground that these two groups within SDF, the Arabs and Kurds, would not take on each other?
Yes, so thank you very much for that question. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, so right now, Daesh has, the evil of Daesh has coalesced these groups, both Arabs, Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria, to fight together and work together. And I think that the relationships that they've developed over the years in this fight will bode well for the future. As I mentioned earlier, I have had the opportunity to meet the commander that was in Raqqa, and he was Arab. I have witnessed the effectiveness of that force, and they continue to be effective all the way down the Euphrates River Valley. Also in Iraq, I was fortunate enough to be at the meeting where the Kurds and the senior leaders and the Kurds and the senior government of Iraq military officials met. And I can tell you that I will leave it to the government of Iraq to talk to you about the specifics and the results of those discussions. But I think all Iraqis, both Kurds and Arabs, can be very proud of the professionalism and compassion and commitment of General Uthman, the Chief of Defense, and Minister Sinjari, the Minister of the Pesh, and the character and wisdom that they displayed throughout those discussions over 2 days to work very hard to come to an agreement that would limit any more Iraqis fighting Iraqis. And that agreement has held for a few days here, and I think we have great optimism that it will continue to hold into the future.
And then, as you have worked with SDF so closely, can you acknowledge, or have you seen any kind of trace that the YPG, a significant component of SDF, has ideological connections with PKK?
Thank you for that question, and obviously that is a concern for many folks, but I have seen no connection between the SDF and the PKK, and we have worked very closely with them for over 2 years. And so we have not seen any evidence of that. Obviously, the United States does not support any terrorist organizations, and so we continue to support the SDF because we have not seen any connection to any terrorist organization.
You said you have seen no evidence, but when during the liberation of Raqqa, the YPG displayed the Öcalan's pictures, the PKK leader, and also dedicated the liberation of Raqqa to the PKK leader. Isn't that an evidence for you to consider that there is a connection between, or ideological connection between YPG and the PKK?
I do not think you're speaking about the formal press conference from SDF leaders and RCC leaders that declared the liberation of Raqqa. During that ceremony, I do not think there was any reference to any terrorist organization or terrorist leaders. While we are aware of some symbols of divisiveness, both in Syria and have been displayed in Iraq in the past, we do not support those, and we do not believe that either the government of Iraq or the senior SDF leadership sanctioned those divisive the display of those symbols.
One last question. According to a mutual agreement between the coalition and Turkey, the YPG, the SDF, the YPG component of SDF would leave Manbij. But according to the Turkish military sources, the YPG elements have not left Manbij yet. Do you have anything to share with us why they have not left yet? And why are they there? What is the reason?
What I can tell you about our relationship with Turkey and especially the military, the TGS, the Turkish military, is that we have a very transparent relationship with them. We communicate with them routinely about all that we're doing in our campaign and our relationship with the SDF. And we have communicated at those levels, and they understand exactly what truth is, and so we've expressed it in those channels, and I feel comfortable that they're satisfied with those responses.
Still on the Kurds and recent attitudes after the events, U.S. Special Operations Forces have probably been the closest to them, and with the training mission and being alongside them. So, what is the mood both from your troops and the other side, the Kurdish troops, since the referendum, the violence, Barzani, everything that's been happening? Because publicly, we're hearing a whole lot of trust and resentment problems from the Kurdish side. What are you hearing getting filtered up from your troops and the Kurdish troops that you're fighting alongside? Is it similar to the public sentiment that we're hearing?
I think that the main thing that we're hearing from our Kurdish partners are that they are committed to working with Iraqi security forces to continue the defeat of Daesh. No Iraqis that I've talked to, Arabs or Kurds, want to see any more Iraqi deaths because of fighting between Iraqis. And so obviously there's been some turmoil and tension between that relationship over the last couple of weeks, but the overriding sentiment between all of our relations is that they want to see a peaceful solution to this, and they want to make sure that we continue our efforts together to defeat Daesh.
Can you give a sense of has it changed any plans for future, training mission, the hold mission, as you shift from those counter assault days to hold and stability ops going forward, especially within Iraq?
So we are continuing to determine what that posture will be. Obviously, we will be here. Whatever the size of the coalition presence will be here at the request of the government of Iraq, and we plan to continue all of the key partnerships. Some of those partnerships are with PESH. Most of them are with the Iraqi security forces. But we are continuing the deliberations and the planning efforts to determine exactly what level will remain and who those key partners will be. And so right now it's a little too early to say definitively, but we do anticipate continuing the relationships with some of the PESH forces.
How concerned are you between the increased reports of fighting between Iraqi security forces and the Kurds?
Well, a couple of different pieces to that. The first one is that there's still Daesh left in Iraq. And all security forces here, the PESH and the Iraqi security forces, are all focused on eliminating that threat. And then once that is done, I think that we collectively will continue to develop and train and advise and assist various partner forces as they reset from the struggle that they've had with Daesh over the years. And I do not, as I said, I was at the meeting here over the weekend, and the leadership that was displayed on both sides, from the PESH leaders and from the Iraqi security force leaders, gives me great optimism that there's a very low chance of any continued conflict internally within Iraq.
So bottom line, you're no longer concerned about this fighting?
I personally am not, no.
And just to go back to the question about U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, just for the sake of the record and the transcript, how many U.S. troops are in Syria and Iraq right now?
So I can give you a better answer for Syria. I don't have that answer for Iraq off the top of my head, but there's 503 forces, coalition forces in Syria.
Now, is that the force management level, or is that actual 503 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria?
There's 503 coalition forces in Syria.
Sir, you mentioned earlier that many SDF were killed or wounded in the taking of Raqqa. Do you have estimates now on how many were killed and wounded, and do you have estimates on how many ISIS were killed and how many surrendered?
Yes, I don't have good ISIS figures off the top of my head, but I do have good SDF numbers. And so throughout the fight, there have been over 1,200 friendly KIA of SDF forces. Specific to Raqqa, there were approximately 434. Wounded throughout the fight in northeast Syria for the SDF is a little bit greater than 2,500. And for Raqqa specifically, approximately 905. So a significant loss to both Kurds and Arabs fighting together to rid northeast Syria of the evil of Daesh. And they are, the SDF, both Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, all of them continue to honor them in their sacrifice. And the world owes them a significant debt for all that they've done to help us rid the world of this evil.
Sir, is it possible of the ISIS fighters who surrendered, what's happened to them?
A lot of those are continue to be detained by the SDF in their facilities in northeast Syria. There were a lot of ISIS that were considered ISIS because of their relationship with the Daesh, but a lot of them were not necessarily fighters. They were in administrative positions, working in hospitals, helping feed the large number of Daesh on the battlefield, and so a lot of those that were captured have been turned, that were local Syrians, have been turned over to their tribal leadership underneath their control. And the SDF leadership feel comfortable that the tribal leadership and the tribal code in northeast Syria will make sure that they maintain control of those individuals. And so we feel pretty comfortable that that is the case. But I can tell you from experience, from driving around, that the security there provided by the local civil councils and the internal security forces is such that it is a very low threat of any Daesh attacks or any Daesh period in northeast Syria. They still have the ability, as closer to the front line of the enemy, as we get closer to the Euphrates River Valley, to infiltrate around the SDF positions. But once you get away from the front lines, it is a relatively secure place throughout northeast Syria.
What is the position of U.S. advisors, the troops, at the negotiations the security negotiations between Baghdad and Erbil? Are they personally attending those negotiations?
There were myself and Lieutenant General Funk had the privilege of being in the room while those discussions were taking place, and we did nothing but listen to those discussions. All of the interaction was between the PESH leadership and the Iraqi Security Force leadership under direction for the PESH, it was Minister Sanjari, and for the Iraqi Security Forces, the Chief of Defense, General Uthman. And again, it was, we had no part of that negotiation. We just monitored it, and it was a privilege to see the character and wisdom displayed by those two leaders. And all Iraqis have a lot to be proud of, that they have leaders like that that are working this difficult situation out.
Are your troops going to be positioned at the border crossings alongside the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga?
If the government of Iraq and the Iraqi security forces and the leadership in the Pesh would like us to be there, then we will take that into consideration, and we will potentially do that. But that will be at the invitation of the government of Iraq.
One last question. The Shia militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, he said in an interview with Associated Press yesterday, and I'm quoting, Iran was the only country that supported Iraq from the beginning of the Daesh crisis, unquote. And before that, a couple of days ago, during a conference in Baghdad, Hadi al-Amri, the Badr militia leader, said, quote, Iran is the one that helped on the ground in Iraq and not the international coalition, unquote. What is your response to that?
I think that the government of Iraq has definitely understands the commitment that the United States and the entire coalition has made to help them, as they have worked very, very diligently and very effectively to rid Iraq of the evil of Daesh. This Daesh was very effective early in their seizing of terrain in Iraq, but together, all of us together, throughout all of the entire coalition, plus our Iraqi security forces, have shown the entire world that Daesh is not welcome in Iraq, and I do not anticipate it's going to be much longer until we can say that they're completely liberated from Daesh.
Do you have any updated estimates on how many ISIS fighters are left in Syria and in Iraq?
We do have a number out there. I mean, it's an estimate. I don't know how. It's not a very high. I don't have a high confidence level of what that is, but you could throw anywhere from 3,000 to 7,000 Daesh that are left throughout the Euphrates River Valley, from up around Dar es-Zawar all the way down to Al-Qaim in Iraq.
And as a follow-up to that, I know you said that Raqqa has been cleared of ISIS influence. How concerned are you and are your SDF partners about sleeper cells, about fighters who are staying there perhaps looking to cause trouble over the long term? And what types of measures are you taking to make sure that they won't be effective if there are any?
And I think that there are several examples throughout northeast Syria that give me confidence in saying that there's a very low probability of any Daesh that remains in Raqqa. There's Manbij, there's Topka, there are other, Ainisha, there are other locations that once they were liberated by the SDF have not had one Daesh attack since then. The other problem with Raqqa is that there are so many unexploded ordnance or munitions that remain there. Just a vignette, we've just now started to have bad weather here in this part of the world as we get closer to winter. And the other day we had the first significant rainstorm in that part of Syria. And there are so many explosive devices still left that the rain was hard and actually was causing some of those explosive devices to detonate. And so there are so many out there, nobody moves around very freely until areas have been cleared of those unexploded munitions by the SDF and by the civilian companies that we have that are working for the international community to assist in this effort. So I think it's a very low probability that there will be any Daesh sleeper cells that remain in Raqqa or any of the locations that the SDF have liberated.
Question, General, if I may. What type of measures are being put in place, or are there measures being put in place to track the Daesh fighters who were handed over to tribal leaders? Perhaps they weren't frontline fighters, but they were still affiliated. Are they being tracked in any way other than the assurances given by the tribal leaders in Syria?
So the solution to that problem was a local Raqawi solution, and I think it's a great news story. Our by, with, and through process means that our partners are the ones that determine how they prosecute this fight. And in this particular instance, it showed that the SDF, who is the military arm and is conducting the military operation to liberate Raqqa, was pressured and convinced by the civil council, the civil leadership in that part of Syria, who listened to the tribal leaders, who are the constituents of the Raqqa Civil Council, to figure out a way to solve this problem that would eliminate any minimize the civilian casualties. I mean, one of the most difficult things for us over the latter days of Raqqa was to watch, as we looked through ISR, and watch civilians trying to flee Raqqa gunned down by Daesh fighters. Absolutely horrific. And so what we did do with the SDF is we did take all of those members and we enrolled them biometrically so that we are able to track them into the future. But this was a good news story for everybody in this part of the country that it was a Syria solution to a Syrian problem. And in the end, it was the civil governance that dictated that solution.
How is the American ISIS fighter going to be prosecuted?
Thank you for that question. And that is not a military, I do not have a military answer to that question. That is the Department of State and Department of Justice problem, and they're working to sort that out. And I am not aware of the answer right now, so I couldn't help you, but it's not a military solution to that problem.
As far as you know, General, he will be flown back to the United States to face federal court?
Again, anything I said would be pure speculation right now, and so I do not have an answer for you, and so I'd even hesitate to speculate. So I think the Department of Justice and Department of State is much better qualified to give you a good answer on that question. I'm sorry.
And lastly, General, as we were sitting here, the coalition, it appears, released a list of ISIS leaders that have been killed recently. My question is, can you talk about those leaders being killed, and have your special operations troops stepped up their attacks on ISIS leaders recently, or as ISIS getting squeezed, have those strikes gotten smaller, airstrikes as well as direct action raids? Thank you.
And so our forces, we are always hunting the senior leadership of Daesh, and we have been from the earliest days, and we continue to do that. I will tell you, it has been harder because everybody is moving. Daesh continues to displace. They were in Manbij, then they were in Topka, then they were in Raqqa, then they moved down to Dar-es-Zawar, then they moved to Ma'adin, and they continue to move down, and right now the last bastion of their existence is around Abu Kamal and Al-Qaim in Iraq. And so we continue to pressure them across the network, senior leaders, the facilitators, all of them, and we have had tremendous success. But it is getting harder. As I mentioned at the outset, I think that the senior leaders are hiding from the coalition. As I mentioned a little earlier, I've been involved in Iraq here for a long time in our counterterrorism efforts, and we normally find the senior leaders hiding in basements or holes in the ground or caves. And I suspect when we find the senior leaders now, that's where they'll be.
You know how long it will take for Raqqa to be cleared of explosive devices, or about how long it will be before people can return to the city safely?
And it is unfortunate that Daesh left the city and tried to prepare those defenses so elaborately and so many unexploded munitions. And so it will take a long time. Raqqa has, like any urban area, has some suburbs that that Daesh did not seed with unexploded munitions as much as others, and so some of those outlying areas have been cleared already, and some families are able to move back in. But the part of Raqqa that was the city center, that was where we ended up fighting the remnants of Daesh that were left there, is going to take a long time, and I do not have a good estimate for you. We have some civilian companies that are helping us clear those areas of unexploded munitions, and this is an area where our coalition partners can also help. We need any and all available experts in this area that can train Syrians to help us increase the capacity of those that are able and willing to clear the ordnance and improve the speed of which it's going to take to do this. But it's not going to be a quick solution. It's going to take a good bit of time, and I'm sorry, I just don't have a good estimate for you. I would like to again congratulate the SDF on a phenomenal record since they've started prosecuting this campaign against Daesh. They continue to amaze us as we watch them and the sacrifices that they continue to endure to assist the world in eliminating this area of Syria from the evils of Daesh, and I continue to thank all the coalition partners that in their efforts as we continue to support the SDF. And thank you for your questions and your time today.
Okay, thank you, sir, and thank you, everybody.